Tiger in a Typhoon. Dear friends, this is the story of a hungry tiger in the typhoon. This story captures the dangers of the jungle, the cunning of the tiger, and the unpredictable forces of nature. Let's listen this story in the word of Hugh as well. It was 1955 and the hot weather nearly at an end. That year the heat had been appalling, and now, at the end of June, Babs and I were feeling the effects and scanning the skies each day for signs of rain. Around the estate everything was tinder dry, and with the earth in the fields like lumps of iron it was difficult to get on with preparations for sowing. The rains were overdue, but the papers had at last told us that the monsoon had broken over southern India. All being well, it should reach us within a few days. Now that the rains were so close, it was time to inspect the nullahs and ravines which drain water from the land and lead it down to the Denwa River. At the start of the rains these often get clogged with fallen trees and the accumulated debris of the year. If this debris is allowed to collect, trouble can follow, loose dams form quickly, and then the force of the current soon jams everything into a solid and hard-to-move mass. That can mean flooded fields for perhaps the whole of the rains. Another thing to watch for is the poachers' fish traps, which always appear just before the rains start. These are low, semicircular walls of loose stone built across the nullah, with a small opening to channel the fish. Dams in miniature, but small as they are, they soon collect debris and often cause a great deal of flooding if they are not found and demolished before the first waters swirl down to the river. One of the poachers' favorite spots, and also one where many natural dams build up, is the Big Nullah. This is always the first place I go to when inspecting before the rains. Sure enough, there was a half-completed fish trap before I had gone a quarter of a mile. No one was near it when I came up, but farther along and round a bend I could hear voices and the sounds of men collecting stones from the nullah bed. I climbed the bank and waited behind a tree. There were two of them, and I let them get right back with their loads before I pounced. They were very sheepish and apologetic, as indeed they should have been. This nonsense has always been a sort of annual fixture, and with monotonous regularity I catch the same men year after year. While they were knocking the wall down, I told them that they could rebuild it after the debris in the nullah had been swept away. They had known to start with that this permission was theirs simply by coming to ask for it, but as it is much easier to build a wall on dry sand than when water is racing down the nullah, the catch-me-if-you-can tactics are always well worth trying. When the last stone had been thrown down, Matthew, the elder of the two men, said, "You want to see the tiger's kill?" To hear him mention that again surprised me. While the wall was still standing, and while pleas were still being made for it to remain so, there had been a casual reference to a tiger's kill, which they said they had found on their way to the nullah. The sudden introduction of that into the middle of the pleading had sounded so fishy that I took no notice. Red herring of the same sort had been drawn across my path before. And not always without success, for on 2 occasions I had set off at once to investigate news of a very similar kind. In the heat of the moment the fish traps had been forgotten, then, hours later, when nothing had been found and it seemed likely that I had been chasing a wild goose, I hadn't had the heart to send the culprits back to demolish their wall, as I could not be sure, and that the poachers were not after all honest fellows only trying to be helpful. "Where is the kill?" I asked. I was interested now and ready to believe that there might be something in the story. With the fish trap down, they had nothing to gain by sending me off on a false scent. Matthew pointed along the nullah. "It's not very far down there, up on the left bank." Then he added, "We think it might be the Mograwala." That was interesting indeed. The Mograwala was a well-known cattle thief, which had been proscribed for more than a year. I motioned them to go ahead and we set off down the nullah. After following it for some 300 yards, we climbed up the bank and then struck off through ground thickly covered with withered bushes and small trees. A short walk brought us up to a patch of thick jungle. Matthew pointed towards it with a finger to his lips. We went in quietly and after 20 yards Matthew pointed again. The kill was a cow which had been dragged half under a spread of lantana and a heavy meal had been eaten off the hind quarters. I was glad to see that it was not one of ours. From where we were standing, it was not far to the pool in the nullah, at this time of the year, the only water for a long way around. When I had thanked the men for showing me the kill, I sent them away, and then set off to the pool to see what I could find. The tiger's pug marks were all round the water. Some of them were fresh, but a lot more showed that the tiger had been using the pool for perhaps 2 weeks. From the signs he was a nice animal and might well be the Mogarwala. I had not been to the pool for quite a while, but 2 weeks is a longish time for a tiger to hang about, and I was wondering why I had not heard of him. Half an hour later I had found 2 more kills in that same patch of jungle. These were older than the first one, and both had been finished by hyenas which had scattered bones over a wide area. Like a jot of other cattle killers, it looked as though the Mogarwala never returned to a kill after the first feed. The 3 dead cows so close together and near the pool suggested that this tiger was unlikely to leave until after the rains had broken. He was obviously getting all he wanted to eat, and he was getting it from the hundreds of straying cattle now wandering the estate. During the hot months of the year these cattle are a perpetual nuisance, and for several reasons, all of them wrapped up in the Indian attitude towards cows. Little or nothing can be done to keep them off the land. The nuisance is considerable and begins each year as soon as the crops are cut. By this time, the weather is warming up and the village pastures are already heavily overgrazed, so what the cattle owners do is drive their animals right out to fend for themselves. No one is in charge of them and they wander where they will. As the hot weather advances and the grazing grows even scarcer, the cattle have to keep feeding both by day and night just to stay alive. Until the rains revive the grass, none of them ever goes home for the good reason that there is nothing to eat there at all. Sooner or later all these cattle wander to the estate where they try to stay. Along the river banks, the pastures are naturally good and not overgrazed if we can stop it. But what a job trying to keep these strays away. The local cattle pound holds only 40 animals and we have to deal with hundreds a day, but even if the pound held them all it would still be no solution. The cattle owners keep a wary eye cocked for anyone leading their animals to the pound. Whenever our men appear with a bunch of strays, word spreads rapidly and there is likely to be a fight. To this state of affairs officialdom merely shrugs its shoulders. The problems posed by Indian cows are so many that no one even tries to solve them. The only thing to do then is keep driving the strays away, but to employ men simply for this is not practical, and so there are always scores of cattle wandering the estate. A paradise for a cattle-killing tiger, and what this one was doing was simply staying put and picking off a cow whenever he was hungry. If he kept to the straying cattle I couldn't care less, but with our own herds wandering the estate too, and with small boys in charge of them, something would have to be done to end the Mogarwala's career. 2 days later he killed again. The victim was another stray cow, which he took at the top of the path, coming up from the pool. Once more he had dragged the body into the same patch of jungle he had taken the others to. On the morning I found this kill, we'd had the first shower of the monsoon which had left the ground soft and the dry leaves sodden. The tiger had eaten a heavy meal and was not likely to be very far away. It was a good chance, for with the ground just right for stalking it might be possible to find him asleep. It was another of those occasions when the tiger found me first and handed out a fright. It may be that I woke him suddenly, or he might have been awake all the time and watching me from behind some bushes. Whatever the truth was, he gave no chance, but sprang away with a roar when he decided that I was too close to be friendly. On my way home for lunch I saw that the black clouds were gathering again. At 2 o'clock the rain started, heavy stuff, which left no doubt that the monsoon had at last arrived. To sit for a tiger in a deluge is neither sensible nor pleasant, so I cancelled the machan I had told Buttu to build. Besides, this tiger would now move off when the rain drove the straying cattle back to the shelter of their mangers. The rain went on all night and there was no sign of it letting up by dawn the next morning. An hour later it was still very dark, for the skies were a lowering mass of black, angry-looking clouds, tinged with an ugly yellow. The rain started to come down harder and thunder began to growl overhead. By mid-morning the barometer on the veranda was as low as I had ever seen it. The weather now looked ugly indeed, and there was something about the sky that alarmed me. Overhead the clouds seemed to be boiling as they lashed out the rain. A few seconds later I had forgotten them when, above the smashing of the deluge, I suddenly heard the roar of the rising river 400 yards away. It was a sound that sent me hurrying back to my raincoat and gumboots. The river of course always rises when the rains start, and it often rises fast. But this rise was too sudden and suggested abnormal conditions which had not been there when I visited the river bank 15 minutes before. When I reached the river, the roar of the racing waters was deafening. Far upstream I could see nothing of the causeway that takes the main road across the riverbed. In its place was a frothing, muddy white line stretching from bank to bank. That meant a rise of nearly 20 feet in perhaps as many minutes. Somewhere up in the mountains about Pachmari, where the Denwa has its source, there must have been a lot more rain than even we *D had. After watching the river for some minutes, I squelched across to the big nullah. I found the water here already over the banks and flooding the land on both sides. The current down the center was like a raging millstream. From force of habit, I started to splash through the water as near to the bank as I could judge. I was looking for the obstruction until I realized that there probably was none. The nullah just wasn't big enough to carry away the tons of water falling from the skies. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon it was nearly dark and a high wind was rising steadily. The cattle, which had gone out as usual in the morning, had been brought back at midday and put in their shed. After that I had sent all the men back to their quarters. In this weather there was nothing anyone could do outside, and by the signs in the sky we had not yet seen the worst of it. The skies were getting darker, and as the rain pelted down the wind was rising to a high wailing shriek. The typhoon struck soon after 6. There was little warning, though a fiery blast of shattering thunder may have been its herald. A few seconds later, the elements went mad and the world was suddenly a howling inferno struck through with violent flashes of vivid violet light. The fury of the wind was frightening. It was roaring through the trees with a speed that appalled, and the whole house was shuddering to the screaming impact. Above the deafening roar, we could hear loud snaps, as branches were torn from the trees, and the grinding crashes as forest giants slammed down before the onslaught. Within 15 minutes of the first blast the roof of the cowshed was torn off bodily. We heard it start to tear loose, then came the rumble and rattle of falling bricks. Hard behind that rose the frantic cries of terrified cattle and the clatter of stampeding hooves on concrete. All at once the clatter stopped, bitten off by the wind with alarming suddenness. As I looked at the damage, the torch was hardly needed. The wreckage was brilliant under the almost continuous lightning. The roof had reared upwards and then levered down one entire longitudinal wall. The debris had fallen on the cattle and 3 of them were still writhing under a mass of splintered rafters and rubble. Of the others there was no sign. With 4 men carrying lanterns, I set off to look for them. The force of the wind now was such that the driving rain really hurt our bare hands and faces. We had scarcely gone 200 yards to the north of the house when we were pulled up short. Stretching away into the night was a solid sheet of water. It covered the field in front of us to disappear into the trees fringing the far side. As far as we could see to the right and left of us there was water everywhere flooding up from the nullah. We turned left and skirted along by the water. Almost at once we found the cattle. They had not gone far and were huddled together under some trees, with the water lapping their legs. By now they had calmed down and gave no trouble when the men started to drive them home. I left the men to it and then set off to find out how bad things really were. The rain was still slashing down, but even so the extent of the flooding from the nullah had come as a shock to me. What about the river? That was a much more formidable force, and as I hurried across to it the first tinge of anxiety rose about the safety of the house. The house is on a part of the estate which is roughly triangular. One side of the triangle is formed by the river. The other side is the nullah which, after running diagonally across the estate, meets the river to form the apex. About the center of the base, between the river and the nullah, the house stands on a slight rise. With my head down, I turned into the wind and fought towards the river in a straight line. Even today I can recall vividly almost every step of that journey. It was like a waking nightmare with the wind nearly strong enough to lean on as it tore past with its unearthly shriek. Long before I should have reached the river, my way was barred by its flooding waters coming to meet me. This was far worse than the nullah. You could see the water creeping up to the thunderous roar, coming from behind the line of trees that marked the river bank in the rain-obscured distance. I was just starting to move on to where the river meets the nullah, 3/4 of a mile from where I was standing, when I caught a sudden flurry of movement across the water in front of me. I switched on the torch quickly. Through the silvery rods of the rain smashing through the beam, I saw a pack of wild dogs scampering towards me. They came on and then jumped to the dry land. They were within a few yards and all round me, whimpering and uttering sharp little cries of alarm. For all the notice they took of me, I might not have been there. As I walked on, I kept the light sweeping across the waters. After a few minutes, I switched it off. The lightning was better. The almost continuous flashes lit the scene around me like daylight. Not far on from where I had left the wild dogs, I saw a small herd of spotted deer, 4 hinds and a stag, splashing out from a wood which in normal times is 100 yards from the river. Now it was an island of trees. They must have seen me as clearly as I could see them, but they splashed on, away from the greater danger of the rising water. When they had passed only a little way behind me, I went on. There was still no sign of the storm abating, and the wind was driving the pelting rain as strongly as ever. The thunder was still crashing with scarcely a break. After another 50 yards, I stopped again. This time there was no going on. The waters now were not only on my left, but on my right as well, and just in front of me they met. The river and the nullah were now a single sheet of water. For a few moments I just stood still staring at the floods. The danger to the house now was very real. From where I was, it was only a quarter of a mile away, and the waters were creeping towards it from 2 sides. I turned quickly and started back. Almost at once I found myself in another nightmare of a different kind. Across my path there was suddenly a great sounder of pigs standing motionless. To get past them I had to skirt to one side in spite of a great throat-tearing shout to move them. Then animals were everywhere. In the flashes from the skies I could see them all around me, some standing still while others moved slowly as though in a dream. I did not know then that we were all on an island only some 10 acres in extent, which was rapidly growing smaller. When I got back to the house, Babs had some coffee waiting on the stove. When I had gulped it down, I went out again to see the cattle. They had been put in an old and long, disused, country shed. The roof was of rough thatch, the sides built of light stakes lashed together with strips of bamboo. The only reason why this was still standing was probably because the wind had no push against its openwork sides. The cattle were very restless. Now that they were locked up again, the collapse of the roof in their old shed was obviously still a vivid memory. They were milling around wildly, barging into one another and crashing against the flimsy sides. If this shed collapsed, it would not be the wind but the cattle which pulled it down. But there was nowhere else to put them. The 3 other sheds were some distance from the house and were already under water when I passed them on my way back. Half an hour later I went out again. The swollen nullah was now within 100 yards of the house, and the river had swept across the base of the triangle to join it. The area of our island had now shrunk to about 3 acres, and there was still no sign of the rain stopping. On my way back to the house I had another look at the cattle. They were still very restless, but still safe inside. That hardly seemed to matter now. I was going to give the rain another hour, and if it had not stopped, then I should let them out to take their chance in the floods. Some 20 minutes later, as we were sitting in a room at the back of the house, it seemed to me that the rain had suddenly slackened. I got up and went out towards the front veranda. When I reached the door leading to it, I stopped and looked out. There was no light outside and none in the room behind me. Beyond the veranda, the lightning was vivid, the scene beneath it as light as day. The rain was stopping. Then, as I stared out at it, a slight movement from the left turned my eyes. A tiger was standing at the end of the veranda. It had been the merest flash of a picture, but clear beyond mistake. The lightning flashed again and it was still there. A moment later I was in the back room grabbing for the rifle. The magazine was full and a torch mounted on the barrel, for I had only recently put it down. Back again at the veranda door, I peered round. The tiger was still there and I snapped on the light. But he didn't wait a second. As the light hit him he sprang out of it and away into the night. The bullet I sent after him was wide and smacked into a concrete trough in the garden. It was the last straw for the cattle. In his flight, the tiger streaked past their shed. That was all they needed. A strong whiff of tiger slammed into their nostrils by the wind. They were stampeding wildly before the echoes of the shot died away. There was a violent crash and the shed was matchwood. Then the cattle were out and thundering away, snorting with terror. As the sounds of their flight faded, I suddenly realized that the rain had stopped. All at once the main sound of the night was the mighty roar of the river. A good sound now. One that told that the dangers of the floods were over. The river falls just as fast as it rises, and that loud booming proclaimed that the waters were receding and racing away to the sea. What the extent of the damage was I could not even guess, but that was something to worry about in the morning. In the meantime, we had to round up the cattle again and somehow bed them down for the rest of the night. That should not take long. They could not have gone raw, as they would certainly keep to the dry land about the house. That there was also a tiger somewhere in that small area was not really much to worry about. That beast had plenty of troubles of his own, for if ever I had seen a frightened animal, it was this tiger when he sprang away, from the veranda. For him it had been any port in the worst storm of his life, and he had been on the veranda only because it must have seemed to him the one safe spot